Hello, I'm Peter. I'll tell you a story that happened to my dad in his youth when he worked for the cleaning service at the funeral home in town. My dad often tells us this story, especially on stormy nights, and I would like to share it with you too. In those times, my dad and Mr. Christopher became friends in those talks when they would go out to smoke in the back of the place. There was no rest for the cleaning people. There was always someone working, even at night and in the early morning. They were always happy when they had a shift together. Even that one, the night shift, because no one gets used to being surrounded by corpses at that time of day. The smell of the dead, my father told me, is the most horrible thing he has ever experienced. One day a woman arrived on the scene, deceased under extraordinary circumstances. It had been days before the neighbors realized that she had died, yet she had not yet begun to smell bad. Her body seemed to be decomposing more slowly than usual. A fat man had also arrived with stab wounds from a sharp weapon. As far as they could tell, he had been killed in a street fight not far from there. That night someone else arrived. The body of a girl, already in a state of decomposition, had been dead for about a month. Some people had found her in the mountains. However, the doctor was not there to start preparing the bodies, and the young man in charge at that time didn't even know what to do with the corpses. My father said that he was the doctor's son, and that was the only reason he had the job and the obligation to cover the doctor's absences. The boy said he couldn't take care of it. He had never dealt with a real work situation on his own and left, so he left, but not before asking the cleaners. My father and Mr. Chris to put the body in the living room next to the other two. That little body of the completely naked girl gave off an unbearable and terrible smell, very different from the others. "Now that they smell her, the other two get up and leave," said Mr. Chris jokingly. My father laughed, and at that moment there was a small sound like a laugh coming from another part of the room, almost imperceptible. This was not my father, and neither had it been Mr. Chris who, seeing each other, hurried to leave. "It's air that keeps coming out of the dead." "Don't worry, you get used to it," said Mr. Chris, and that was something my father already knew too. But what they had just heard sounded very different. A little later they received a call. It was the doctor. He asked them questions about the dead that had arrived, and was quiet when he heard the girl's description. "Listen well. Listen very carefully to what I'm going to tell you. Place the other two bodies in the room. Lock the room where the girl is. And if you have finished your work, you may leave." They asked him if there was anything out of the ordinary, but he only answered that it was administrative matters, and that he would go as soon as he could, so that the place would not be left alone. This city is not very big, and there is not much activity in the funeral home as there might be in other types of cities, so the situation was not so far-fetched. My father and Mr. Chris still had a lot to do, so they decided to finish with the pending cleanup, then move the bodies before retiring. They divided up the work to finish it faster, and left, each to one end to begin work. After an hour or so, my dad finally arrived in the hallway, outside where the bodies were, and from inside the room, there was a thump, and then as if some metal trays fell. "Hey Chris, wait for me." Now we moved them between the two of us. He shouted. "What are you talking about?" Mr. Chris replied from the other end of the aisle, poking his head out of a room. My father turned pale and ran to him. He swore he heard something moving inside the room where the corpses were. "How do you think?" "Let's go and see," said Mr. Chris, evidently thinking that my father had imagined the sound, perhaps nervous because of what had happened a while before. Outside the rain was increasing, but that was common at that time of year. However, that night it was only contributing to the atmosphere of mystery that was beginning to take over the place, and that made my father more and more nervous. "Let's not go in. Let's wait out here," he said. "We have to go in at once and move them so we can leave," answered Mr. Chris, and go. "Are you really going to leave with this storm raging out there?" The two were walking home from work, so Mr. Chris realized that it was not a possibility to leave at that time. "Well, come on, make yourself a coffee or something while I check the living room." He then stayed in the small living room he was in, and my father went to the small room that was used as a dining room. He made some coffee, and a few minutes later he heard Mr. Chris leave the room he had just finished to go check the living room with the bodies. After a few seconds, he heard him scream. My father became very nervous at that moment, on the verge of a collapse or a panic attack. It was normal, he thought, in the time he had been working there. He had already seen what dead bodies, storm, and constant lightning can do to a person who has to spend the night there, especially on nights like that when they were left alone for some reason. He finished the room he was cleaning and headed to the living room thinking that it was going to be his turn to move the bodies alone, and that, as had already happened with others, perhaps my father would not return to work there the following night. He prepared himself before opening the door to the living room, holding his nose, knowing that the unbearable smell of rotting flesh that the girl was giving off would come out. Before opening, a quick movement behind the door caused a loud, clear noise. Without thinking, he opened the door to find out what it was, and the 3 bodies remained on the stretchers, but one of them, the girl's, had moved out of place. An almost hypnotic vision made him concentrate more and more on that little body, trying to understand what was happening. And at that moment, a very slight movement in one of the girl's fingers, almost imperceptible, made him close the door, screaming in terror. That was the scream my father heard, and he ran to see what was happening. Mr. Christopher told him that maybe he had imagined it, but what happened next was not at all a figment of his imagination. He went with my father to the dining room, telling him what he thought he had seen. Now it was he, the one with the nerves, who seemed to be on the verge of a panic attack. They both tried to calm down in the dining room, and outside, the storm seemed to begin to calm down as well, until a flash of lightning rumbled the place, and seconds later darkness. It was common at that time, and in that weather, to suffer power outages. But they could not have imagined a worse time for that to happen. The storm increased, but they both knew it was time to take advantage of the permit and leave as soon as possible. "Aren't we going to move them then?" my father asked. "If you want to go and move them yourself," Mr. Chris replied. "I'm not going there anymore, even if I get kicked out tomorrow." As they headed for the door, the sounds of footsteps outside in the hallway stopped them completely. Mr. Chris turned to look at my father, both of them wondering with their eyes if they had really heard what they had just heard, or if they were hallucinating. Just then, as if it was getting under the door, a smell of rotting flesh began to flood the dining room, a smell of death. Without saying anything, they secured the door and stood in the corner of the room in silence, waiting for the door to suddenly burst open and a ghastly sight to enter through it. My father peered out of the small window overlooking the street. It looked deserted and seemed to have run out of light, and in the background, on the corner, around the corner. Suddenly, the lights of a car began to approach. Then they pulled into the funeral home parking lot. My father recognized the doctor's car. The parking lot faced the back door. The stench suddenly went away, and my dad and Mr. Chris, without thinking, ran out into the parking lot to meet the doctor. They found him petrified in the driver's seat, still with the car running, staring blankly. Moments later, they managed to get him to react, and he asked them to accompany him inside before entering the room. My father and Mr. Chris asked him to wait, that he didn't know what had been happening that night. "There is nothing to be afraid of in there," said the doctor, and then he opened the door. The scene they saw next marked them forever. The fat man's belly was wide open. There were parts all over the place, as if it had exploded. The woman had bite marks on her face. My father and Mr. Chris quit the next morning. Some time later, Mr. Chris ran into one of the ladies who also worked in the funeral home office, and who had also recently left the place. She told him that the doctor had lost his job. The fat man had had some organs removed from his abdominal area, as if they had been eaten, the doctor said. But he could never explain what happened, and it was not something that could be overlooked, as you can imagine, especially when the family members complained about the state of their loved one's body. When the doctor left that place for the last time, he asked the lady not to stay long, to look for another job. He also told the lady that the doctor in charge of the funeral home before him had told him on several occasions about that naked girl stinking of death, who had disappeared from the funeral home, without a trace years before. The same girl that the doctor said he saw running out of the funeral home and escaping to the mountain on that occasion when he arrived to meet my father.
And Mr. Christopher,